This discussion is about stress, the immune system, and infection as it affects the neurobiology. There's been a lot of researches that were geared towards the discovery of possible causes of mental illness. And psychoimmunology is one of the promising fields that studies the effect of psychosocial stressor on the body's immune system. Let's take a look and listen at this clip.
Psychoneuroimmunology is the growing field of study that blends behavioral science with neurological, endocrine, and immune processes. Is that there is a bi-directional conversation happening between the body and the mind, meaning that the body can affect the thoughts we have, while our thoughts can also affect our physical bodies through the immune, hormone, and neurological systems. A constantly stressed brain will create changes to the physical structure of the brain and lead to decreased immune function. This pathway can work the other way around as well. Having chronic inflammation, autoimmune conditions, recurrent infections, or even chronically elevated blood sugar levels also affects the functioning of the brain. When someone is experiencing physical or mental symptoms, it's now becoming very apparent that both the mind and body need to be addressed if we want to get to the root cause. Psychoneuroimmunology explains how interconnected our systems truly are and how we must look at the person as a whole to make real changes to our health and well-being.
The genetics and heredity. It talks about the current theories. We will relate these two concepts, the genetics and heredity, with several mental disorders. It has been described here that there is a specific gene or a gene combination that in any way will affect the functioning of the brain, whether it is a normal physiology or it is a pathophysiological origin. And this will play an important role. And speaking of genetics and heredity, when these are of concern, we cannot do away with the discussion of the very known topic called the Human Genome Project. This Human Genome Project is an international scientific research project, and it talks about human DNA, and it talks about mapping of all the genes of human genome. Well, psychiatric nursing is, or psychiatry is one of the fields that's been benefited by this project that is ongoing for almost 3 decades and going on the 4th decade. And still, this is a project is still on progress. This project is geared towards the optimization of data analysis, and attempt has been made to sequence the entire genome, and it's costing very huge amount of money. Identification of complete human genome, the creation of databases to store all of that data, and the most controversial of all with this project is, of course, the legal, the ethical, and the social impact that it is creating. Now, let's take a look and listen on how exactly is this being the point of conversation worldwide.
Genetics helps us understand the biological programming behind all life forms. Each human has between 20,000 and 25,000 genes. This collection, called a genome, determines a person's traits by influencing factors on a cellular level. At the turn of the 21st century, an international effort to decode human DNA was launched. Called the Human Genome Project, it ended up identifying about 99% of the entire human genetic sequence.
A revolution in medical science whose implications far surpass even the discovery of antibiotics.
Discoveries in genetics research have unearthed tremendous opportunities in medicine, such as genetic testing and the manipulation of genes. But with these opportunities come risks and ethical questions, and finding the answers to those questions may be the next stage of our understanding of genetics.
And so that is the Human Genome Project. The human race, for all we know, is still expecting and hoping for a revolutionary change, not only in the field of psychiatry, but as well in the field of immunology, where what we are experiencing right now will demands a very concrete answer from our scientists. And thankful that they are still working on with the scientific researches. Let's move on to another topic. This discussion is about neurotransmission. Let this discussion be the center of our discussion of the most important concept in neurobiology. For this discussion, we'll answer the question of how does the brain works. What you are looking right now is a section within a billions of neurons that we have in our brain. There's a flickering lights, an electrochemical signal transmitted from one neuron to another. And this is happening within a wink of an eye. This is happening at the split of a minute or a second. And let's take a closer look as to a much magnified picture of a neuron. This is magnificent. This is how fast. This is the most intricate physiology that is happening in our body. The transmission of neuron, or what we call the neurotransmission. And let's take an even more closer look to that. This is a single neuron. Now, as you may recall, in your anatomy and physiology, as well as in your microbiology, you have seen this before, and I bet you are very familiar with this. Let's try to recall. In the middle or center, this is what we call the cell body, and the nucleus is within the centermost. There are a lot of organelles that's present here. There are multiple endings at the body of the neurons, and these are what we call the dendrites. This part of the neuron receives the signal from one neuronal axons. And going down below, there is a tail structure going down, but before that, there is a structure called axon hillock. This is where the depolarization takes place. Now, when I say depolarization, that pertains to a shift in the chemical charge or electrochemical charge of the cell. And that the signal, the electrochemical signal, will go down below to the structure called an axon. Now, as you may notice, axon is being enveloped. It is being covered by a structure called a myelin sheath. This myelin sheath is being composed of structures other than the neurons. Now, neurons are not alone in the brain parenchyma. They are together being joined by, filled by, assisted by some other structures called the glial cells. Now, as you may notice, there's glial cells comes in the form of astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, microglia, satellite cell, ependymal cell, Schwann cells, that's to name a few. As you may notice, it envelopes the axon. As the electrochemical signal traverses through this, it creates a saltatory conduction whereby it speeds up the axon in between the nodes of Ranvier of the myelin sheath. And this is where the important pathophysiology is happening. That is of importance to our discussion in neurobiology. Now, let's take a closer look at this structure. This is what we call the myelin sheath. And in the process, the destruction of a myelin sheath is called demyelinization. However, there's a possibility of remyelinization, but there are a lot of damage that can lead to the problem of the mental health. One of that is the Guillain-Barré syndrome. To name some, multiple sclerosis is also happening if there is demyelinization. And Alzheimer's disease is also happening that will resemble an atrophy in the size of the brain. That is because being caused by demyelinization. Now, further, as we travel down to the terminals of the neurons, we are reaching the terminal of the axons, from which we call this as the synapse. The synapse are the terminal endings of the axon. If you may notice, there are circular structure called the vesicles. And these vesicles carry within it the neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters, as you may look at it, as it reaches the presynaptic endings of the axon, the neurotransmitters are released down to the receptor of another dendrites of another neuron. I want you to take note that it is very important that the quantity of neurotransmitter shall be proportionate to what is required by the body. Any excess or any deficit of neurotransmitter will create a problem. Okay, I want you to take note that in a neurotransmitter, that in a presynaptic junction, we call this whole thing as a presynaptic or a junctional area between a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron. And in between, we call the space as synaptic cleft. Now, I wanted to take a closer look at the vesicle. Within the vesicle, a triangle structure represents the neurotransmitter. And if you may look at this, the neurotransmitter will be released from a presynaptic neuron as it enters the receptor of another dendrites of another neuron. Some of the neurotransmitter that are excess between the synaptic cleft will be degraded, or either it will be reuptake or taken back by some of the enzymes, and those enzymes can either be a monoamine oxidase or a catechol or methyltransferase. And I want you to remember this because this will play an important role in our psychopharmaceutic mechanism. Now, as I have mentioned, there must be a definite number of neurotransmitter to be released that is only proportionate to what is required. Any deficit or any excess or any malfunction in the process of neurotransmission will lead to several mental issues. And this can either include a behavioral or a mood change, such as there can be malfunction of your moods and behavior. That's why you are suffering sometimes from aggression. Some are suffering from depression, compulsion. That's why people are suffering from anxiety. Some tends to be very happy, and we call that condition as euphoria. That's an excessive neurotransmitter. Some can be very sad, some can be melancholic, some may feel worthlessness, and some may feel emptiness in their life. That's why they tend to overeat sometimes. Now tell me who's guilty. Other than that, it's possible that they may exercise hypersomnia, insomnia, and some other sleeping disorders. And the worst, our patient may suffer from or may commit suicide due to extreme depressions. And this is all about the neurotransmitter. And in our next discussion, we will be talking about each and every neurotransmitter that is being released in the process of neurotransmission. Serotonin. This is the molecular model of a serotonin together with the chemical formula. Serotonin controls the mood. This kind of a neurotransmitter will determine your mood, particularly for well-being and happiness, together with sleep cycle and the regulation of your digestive system. And if you want to enhance this serotonin in your body, then exercise will do, as well as exposure to light. Now let's hear some more discussion regarding serotonin at this point.
Serotonin, present in the brain and digestive tract, Inhibitory neurotransmitter serotonin has been identified as an important factor in mood, depression, anxiety, sleep quality, emotions, and the regulation of appetite and body temperature. Serotonin imbalances are involved in depression, impulse behavior, sleep, and emotional disorders.
And so that's it. If you are having problem with sleep, if you are having problem with anxiety, having problem with your emotion, blame it to serotonin. Let's take a notice that when serotonin is down, represented by that arrow, then more likely you will suffer from depression. However, when serotonin is up, represented by that arrow, then you will tend to be happy. Now, for the last time, I would like you to remember serotonin as a neurotransmitter that makes you smile, and that is serotonin. The adrenaline. Here's the chemical formula of adrenaline, and this is the molecular model of adrenaline. Adrenaline is otherwise known as the epinephrine. Adrenaline is the fight or flight, either a hormone or a neurotransmitter. If you still remember, adrenaline is a product of the adrenal glands, particularly the adrenal medulla. Adrenaline forms part of what we call the catecholamines, including that of the noradrenaline and the dopamine. Adrenaline is being produced in a stressful situation. So whenever you're in danger, adrenaline will be produced by your body. And physiologically, adrenaline can cause an increases in your heart rate and blood flow. It will lead to physical boost and heightened awareness. Now let's hear some discussion.
Epinephrine. Widely known as adrenaline, epinephrine is both a neurotransmitter and a hormone that is essential to metabolism, attention, mental focus, and our innate response to stress, fear, anger, panic, or excitement. Abnormal levels of epinephrine are linked to sleep disorders, anxiety, hypertension, and lowered immunity.
Let us not forget, adrenaline is a neurotransmitter of fight. So be ready to fight when you have adrenaline. This is dopamine, the chemical formula and the molecular model. Dopamine gives a feeling of pleasure like that of the addictions. That's why addicts are prone to dopamine. The movement and motivation as well. The people will repeat behaviors that will lead to dopamine release. Once you happen to love something, you keep on doing something, and dopamine is being released. What if we listen to a discussion?
Dopamine. Dopamine functions as both an inhibitory and excitatory neurotransmitter and is critical for memory and motor skills. Dopamine plays a role in behavior, learning, sleep, mood, focus, attention, immune health, and pleasurable reward.
I would like you to remember that if there is an increase or excess in dopamine secretion in your brain, then that's dangerous for having schizophrenia. What about if your dopamine will be reduced? If there is a deficient in dopamine, then watch out for this. A decrease in dopamine will result to tremors like that of the Parkinsonism. And as well, associate dopamine with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Look at that young guy. He is having a deficient of dopamine. And once and for all, I want you to remember dopamine as a neurotransmitter of pleasure. That's for addiction. The noradrenaline, also known as the norepinephrine. This belongs to a family of catecholamines together with epinephrine and dopamine. If epinephrine is for fight, noradrenaline or the norepinephrine is for flight. This is the chemical formula and this is the molecular model. Norepinephrine or the noradrenaline affects attention, and there's corresponding action in the brain. This causes vasoconstriction, and it increases the blood flow. Let's listen to further discussion.
Norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline and widely distributed throughout the body, norepinephrine acts as a neuromodulator, optimizing brain performance. As part of the body's fight or flight response, norepinephrine quickly provides an accurate assessment of danger of stressful situations. Excessive amounts of this chemical, especially when no actual danger exists, can leave you anxious and hyperactive.
The noradrenaline, when deficient or when there's a lack of noradrenaline, it may lead to a condition called anxiety and or depression. Further, a deficient noradrenaline can also lead to a behavior that is similar to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Let us not forget and let us remember, noradrenaline is a neurotransmitter of concentration. This is acetylcholine with its chemical formula and the molecular model. Acetylcholine is responsible for memory, learning, and thought, all combined. Even the muscle action is involved in acetylcholine, together with attention and awakening. Let us listen to further discussion.
Acetylcholine, ACH. This widely distributed excitatory neurotransmitter was the first neurotransmitter to be identified. ACH triggers voluntary muscle contractions, controls the heartbeat, and stimulates the excretion of certain hormones. Research suggests that ACH may be critical for sleep, attentiveness, sexuality, and memory.
Okay, acetylcholine, when in deficit, will lead to a dreadful condition called Alzheimer's disease. That's a severe dementia. And let us not forget and remember, acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter of learning. This is GABA, or the gamma aminobutyric acid, with its chemical formula and the molecular model. GABA keeps and calms firing nerves in your CNS. And the high level of GABA will improve your focus, and that makes good sense. However, the low level of GABA will lead you to anxiety. This GABA contributes to motor control and your vision. Let's listen to a discussion.
GABA. As the major inhibitory neurotransmitter widely distributed through the brain, GABA is considered a significant mood modulator. When GABA levels are too low or GABA action is impaired, neurons can become overexcited, which can lead to restlessness, anxiety, and irritability.
That's GABA. I want you to remember that when the GABA is low, irritability may happen in your brain. And this is one typical example. This is a condition called epilepsy, where there are continuous tremor, the nerves keeps on firing in your CNS. Likewise, when the GABA is low, you will find difficulty in sleeping at night, and that's what we call insomnia. Now, I want you to remember GABA as a neurotransmitter that keeps you calm. That's GABA. This is glutamate with its chemical formula and the molecular model. Glutamate, this is the most common neurotransmitter, and this is primarily involved in memory and in learning. It regulates the development and creation of nerve contacts. Let's listen to further discussion.
Glutamate, the most common neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. Glutamate is an excitatory relative of GABA that is involved in most aspects of brain functioning, including cognition, learning, and memory. Glutamate is considered a major mediator of the excitatory signals, regulating the brain development as well as the elimination and formation of nerve synapses.
Glutamate. Let us remember that an excessive glutamate, that's why we are trying to avoid the glutamate, the monosodium glutamate, or the MSG, commonly known in the household as benzene, because an increase or excessive glutamate may lead to seizure or epilepsy. Likewise, an increase or excessive glutamate may lead to a migraine, that is an excessive headache. And I want you to remember and do not forget that glutamate is a neurotransmitter of memory. This discussion is about the brain imaging technique. This is intended in order to visualize the internal structure of the brain or the skull. The following are the techniques that we will discuss. These are the CT scan, the MRI, and the PET or SPECT scan. CT scan was formerly called as the CAT scan or the computerized or computed axial tomography, while MRI pertains to magnetic resonance imaging, and PET pertains to positron emission tomography, while SPECT stands for single photon or positron emission tomography. Let's look into the dynamics on how it works. As you may notice, CT scan or computed tomography uses an X-ray and computer combined together in order to produce a diagnostic multiplanar image. One of the advantages of CT scan is that it is less costly compared with other imaging modalities such as of the MRI and the PET scan. However, the disadvantage of this imaging technique is that it uses radiation, particularly the X-ray, which in any way can be considered as harmful to human. However, when used in diagnostic imaging, the benefits outweighs the risk. Now, let's look into the images. The images can be described as multiplanar. If you may take a look at the left side, the upper left side, you may look at the basal area of the brain, which is cut on a 5 millimeter interval as we go along up to the vertex of the skull. And it's also capable of reproducing images on a sagittal plane together with the coronal plane. Now, I want you to focus on this radiograph. As you may look at this, the three upper radiographs of the brain conveys or this portrays a normal imaging of CT scan of the brain. However, when you look down below, you may notice that there are differences with the contrast and density. There is a bigger or a broader area of ventricles of the brain on transaxial cut on the middle area. And that signifies that there is a brain atrophy that is happening together with the cortices and the meninges. As we look here, and even in a sagittal cut. Now, this computed imaging technology nowadays is gradually being considered as a bit obsolete due to the advent of an MRI. Now, our next discussion, we will look into the magnetic resonance imaging. Let's look into MRI imaging or the magnetic resonance imaging. This imaging technique uses a machine with a very strong magnetic field and combined with a radio frequency wave that will generate the images of the brain and other internal organs. Let's look into the dynamic on how it works. Now, MRI uses a strong magnetic power, and that is we're talking of 1 Tesla or 2 Tesla of magnetic power. That is, if you have watched the movie of X-Men, this is like Magneto. In a very big gantry that you're seeing, this is a structure called gantry. It's like a donut structure. Inside that is a very powerful magnetic device that can pull an object made of metal That's why one of the precautions when subjecting the patient to MRI is they should be made aware that the patient with the unortho devices or a metallic implant shall be notified before being brought to MRI and for the doctor to decide. Together with the pacemaker, a patient with a pacemaker will be having a great trouble when brought to MRI department because it can stop the pacemaker and will cause the death of the patient. Another precaution when patient is being put into the gantry, that very narrow hole, is that the patient will suffer from claustrophobia. That is a fear of narrow spaces, and that would be dangerous for the patient if the patient cannot tolerate the feeling of claustrophobia. Other than that, there will be a very loud hammering sound of radio waves that the patient cannot tolerate, and the patient is being given the earplug in order to prevent from too much sound frequency. Let's consider as well that another disadvantage of MRI is that this can be very costly for a patient, such as double the price of the CT scan and 5 folds to 10 folds of the cost of ordinary radiographic imaging. However, talking about the advantages of MRI is that the images being produced in MRI are considered to be dynamic, that is in motion, and there will be a great appreciation of the details of the radiograph being produced in MRI. Let's take a look into the detail of the images. Now, if you may see here, okay, in the imaging of MRI, even the blood flow can be appreciated. Even the CSF fluid can be appreciated when the radiologist will be reading the images. There's a lot of details that the radiologist can get from the images of MRI. And that is because this imaging device uses a magnet instead of radiation. And that MRI can also be considered as a radiation-free. There is no radiation when using MRI. Looking further into the detail of the image of a patient with the psychiatric problem, particularly the patient of schizophrenia, you may notice that at the right side, we have here a coronal cut of image. And if you may see, this is a study of a well patient at the right side with the normal ventricles of the brain and cortices of the brain. However, at the left side, this is an abnormal study of a schizophrenic patient with an enlarged ventricles bilateral, and the cortices are not intact. And so, this is MRI imaging. Finally, we have reached the last of the imaging technique. This is the PET or the SPECT, or the positron emission tomography. This imaging technique is a functional imaging technique that uses a radioactive substance. When we say we are using a radioactive substance, this is in a way must be dealt with precaution because we're using a radiation chemicals here. These are what we call the radio tracers. These radio tracers will be injected into the body of the patient, to the vessels that will serve its purpose to visualize and notice some metabolic changes into the body and other physiological activities, including the blood flow, the chemical composition, and absorption. As the body is being sent into the imaging scanner, all of this can be observed. Now, let's take a look into the images that is being produced. Now, if you may notice here, there are also transaxial cut of the images from the base up to the vertex. These are a fine 5 mm cut of slices of the brain shortly after the introduction of radio tracers. Now you may notice here that there are different colors that are emanating from this radiograph, colored as yellow and red or red-orange. You may see that the radio tracers portrays a radioactivity or higher metabolic activity at the parts of the brains from which concentration will be greater. At this point, you may see that the ventricles are well delineated. This is because of the cerebrospinal fluid that has accommodated much of the radiotracers. And that's it. This is PET or the SPECT imaging.